Savannah, Georgia is known around the world for its southern charm and hospitality. Tradition is important here, and the Black communities of Savannah look out for each other. But in 2018, a betrayal claimed the life of one of the city's most beloved leaders and activists, robbing them of their strongest voice in the fight to end gun violence. From its historic buildings to oak trees draped in Spanish moss, few cities embody the Old South more than Savannah, Georgia.
Savannah is a unique, magical place. It is the mother city in Georgia, founded in 1733.
This city, it captivates you. Its rich history, its charm. And there's something about it that just grabs you and pulls you in.
Its cobblestone streets are lined with historic buildings dating back to the birth of the country.
Savannah is the home of the oldest African-American church in North America, First African Baptist Church.
The city hasn't changed much as far as the structure of it over the past couple of 100 years. It takes your breath away. You'll be hard-pressed to find another city that is as beautiful as Savannah.
Millions of tourists visit each year to shop along River Street and dine at some of the finest restaurants Southern Georgia has to offer.
You're right on the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. So obviously you can just only imagine the fish, all types of different seafood. And that's one of the big draws to Savannah.
But for all of its southern charm, Savannah faces the same problems as larger cities.
There's a dichotomy between the gorgeous Victorian houses, the southern romance that brings everyone here, and the have-nots, literally just a few streets over.
There are communities within Savannah that have had issues, systemic issues, for generations. And I think a lot of it comes from, the inability to have opportunity. And the poverty with the combination of not having the opportunity really does cultivate crime within that community.
What makes Savannah a bit more unique is the fact that it also has a problem with gang activity. And that was a huge problem in the early 2000s.
And in the early morning hours of June 15th, 2018, the city got a reminder of just how dangerous its streets could be.
St. Jim 911, where's your emergency?
Please, somebody help me. I'm in the new apartment across from Fred Russell. Somebody just got shot.
Around 2 a.m., Savannah police respond to reports of a shooting outside an apartment building on Randolph Street.
Upon arrival, the responders observed a large black man shot several times in the parking lot of the apartment complex.
For many of the city's neighborhoods, it's a scene that has become all too familiar.
Gun violence in Savannah is unfortunately a fact of life. In fact, in 2015, there were 53 homicides. You can drive through Savannah, certain parts of Savannah, and hear gunshots at night, on any given night.
But this time, the victim is someone everybody knows and loves. 32-year-old community leader and activist, Shantre Grant. Known as Puff to his friends and family, Shantre was a homegrown hero, born and raised in Savannah.
He loved his hometown. He was one of, I think, 12 or 13 children who were raised in the coastal empire.
Shantre was like a 10-pound baby when he first came. He was so big and red, like the Cheetos, the Puff Cheetos. So everybody just started calling him Puff.
Even as a young man, Shantre showed an aptitude for leadership, serving on the drum line of his high school band.
not a core marching band. I mean, it's like, it's a soul marching band. So he represented some of the richest in African-American tradition.
By the time he was a teenager, Chantre had grown so tall, it was easy to spot him on the field. But it was the size of his heart that earned him the love of his peers.
They call him the gentle giant. He's like a teddy bear. But he was that person that when you had no one else to call, you could call him and he would be like, I'm on it. Don't worry about nothing.
He was always making people laugh. If you met him once, you always know him.
After graduation, Chantre turned his attention to the culinary arts, working as a chef in several restaurants before opening his own business, S&K Catering and DJ Services. He also volunteered with community groups and served as a mentor for at-risk youth.
Chantre recognized early on that if we can save our youth early, then we can reverse this cycle. We want our children to live better and our community to be better.
He grew up seeing his father very active in his community. So this was, ingrained in Chantre to want to give back.
Activism is in the Grant blood. They're following in the legacy of all the folks that have come before us.
He was also a dedicated activist and founder of the Bullhorn Crew, a group dedicated to ending gun violence.
When murders happen in Savannah, he goes out to the murder scene and he be with that family.
You see Chantre at a scene before you see the news people. He's like the first one on the scene. He got that bullhorn in his hand. He's walking up and down the street hollering.
This was his town, and he wanted the violence to stop. He felt that, hey, I'm going to pick up my bullhorn because I want people not just in the Savannah community to hear this, about the injustices, about the violence, about the black-on-black crime. We want people all over the world to see what's happening here in Savannah, and we want change.
If it happened 2 o'clock in the morning, he'd get up out of his bed and he'll go there. I believe it was a passion, because everything he did from the heart.
Over the years, Chantre's efforts began to make a difference in the community.
He had a major following during this time. Every young Black person in Savannah wanted to be a part of the Bullhorn Crew, and they could be a part of it. He didn't turn away anybody because there's strength in numbers.
They said kids are the future, and the kids are out here with guns in their hand, and they're getting a hold of guns because they're not educated. They don't know what guns can do, what the consequences are.
In 2015, I lost my youngest and only son, and that's how I met Puff. I was introduced to this horrible club that I didn't want to be a member of. I had a son who just got killed. I did not even know that there were 400 other mothers at that time who had lost sons, and we did a balloon release and some candles, and they were there. And so I, on that day, joined the Bullhorn Crew.
You know, all you hear is, well, somebody got shot over there, and the next day it's gone. So that's what he wanted to bring awareness of.
We found ourselves again at the same spaces, working for the same families, being there, being present in the moment for the same groups of people.
When you work with people, you can tell if somebody's different. You just know that the experience is real, that you may not be able to experience this again with anybody else.
Now Chantre has been struck down by the same violence he dedicated his life to stop. And both the police and his community want to know why.
I remember just feeling really vexed about the whole thing because he was so against gun violence, so against black-on-black crime.
The same thing that you were fighting for, was the thing that killed you.
The biggest question, how could this have happened? How could this have happened to Shantre Grant?
Savannah's black communities make up over 50% of its population, and some have been there since before the Civil War.
The Underground Railroad came through Savannah. There's evidence of that here. These tunnels that we know exist got from places in the city to the river.
The Gullah Geechee community is huge in Savannah. Following slavery, they said, this is the area where we want to settle and where we want to raise our family. So you're talking about generations and generations.
It's a reminder to young folks and old folks alike that the way we live now, we did not always live. People had to sacrifice. People had to risk their lives, and in some cases gave up their lives.
But many are still losing their lives to poverty and to crime.
Everybody used to go from house to house, playing. You stay out till after dark. Now it's so much killing, and it's like people just don't respect anybody anymore.
And now the latest victim is a beloved leader in the community, 32-year-old Shantre Grant.
And I got out there and I see my brother just laying on the ground. It was like someone snatched the breath out of me.
I got the call around 3 o'clock that morning. DeAndre was on the phone. He said Shantre got killed. Before I could even call the rest of my family to let them know, it was already all over Facebook.
It sent shockwaves through the Savannah community and a lot of people who loved and knew him for so long.
It was unbelievable that a young man who stood for so much in the community could fall victim to violence the way he did. Obviously, people wanted to quickly know, how did this happen? Who would want to do something like this to someone who was so beloved in our community?
Officers secure the area outside the apartment complex and begin searching for evidence. They find several 9mm shell casings near Shantre's body. It appears that he'd been ambushed by at least one gunman as he got out of his vehicle.
The investigators were led to believe that this was a possible armed robbery because the victim's wallet and money were missing.
His brother knew that he had a gun, so not only did they rob him, they took his gun.
Shantre was a big guy. He didn't feel like he had to take many precautions, but he wasn't so, naive to think that he could not himself fall victim to violence. So yes, he was armed. He was armed that night.
But it doesn't appear that Shantre attempted to defend himself. The medical examiner determines that he'd been shot a total of 8 times, 5 of which were in the back.
Immediately, we went out to the apartment complex. Everyone we spoke to said this had to be random. There is no way that this person could have known that this was Shantre Grant.
Over the course of the following day, investigators speak with friends and family and begin putting together a timeline of what happened.
People who were close to Shantre Grant knew that he liked to gamble. And he did it often, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And he would take his friends, some of his girlfriends with him. And the night of his murder, he had done just that.
Shantre was at a riverboat down in Brunswick, which is about 70 miles away.
Shantre had gambled that night with a group of his friends. They told police that everyone had a good time, but Shantre was the big winner.
Shantre Grant had won about $12,000 that night. And because of that, the casino owners made sure that security went to Chantre Grant after he collected his winnings and actually escorted him off the boat, walked him over to his car to make sure that he safely got to where he was going.
After celebrating the victory, Chantre drove 2 of his friends home from Brunswick.
He proceeded to go to his apartment where another friend lived, dropped her off near her apartment, and as he came back to park closer to his own apartment, he barely had the opportunity to open his door because someone was waiting for him. As soon as he cracked open his door, the suspect was standing there and shot him 8 times.
Was it possible someone on the boat that night followed Chantre back to Savannah to take his winnings?
How in the world could someone have known, just in a random crime, that Chantre Grant is pulling up to an apartment he had only lived in for a few weeks? The details about his night, the money that he had won, the fact that he was armed, they knew that this was not a random crime. They believed, Chantre Grant's friends believed, that he had been set up.
$45,000. Savannah, Georgia isn't exactly a small town, but its communities are tightly knit, which can sometimes be an advantage to law enforcement.
There's a misconception about when crimes are committed in big cities like New York or Los Angeles. In larger cities, because of current technology, you've literally got security cameras on every street and every block. In a small town, you don't have that same technology. And a lot of times, cases are solved through word of mouth because everybody knows everybody. It's the detective's job and responsibility to keep asking the questions to get the answers that you need to solve the case.
While Savannah police search for leads in the murder of local activist Chantre Grant, the city comes together to honor his memory. On June 22nd, a vigil is held at the spot where Chantre was killed.
Being a reporter in Savannah for the past 4 years, I've been to far too many vigils. And there had to be 200 to 300 people that showed up. There were 2 community activists, Dietrich Leggett and Linda Wilder Bryan, who are both on city council right now. They were there spearheading the initiative to raise awareness. And not only raise awareness of his memory, but to also have a community take a proactive stance in finding his killer.
A few days later, a memorial service is held and Chantre Grant is laid to rest.
You would have thought a Hollywood entertainer had died. There were hundreds and hundreds of people who packed that church that day to say goodbye, to pay homage.
During his funeral services, Savannah came together. Savannah showed a lot of love. The benefits held for his funeral services, they showed a lot of love. I think he would have been very, very satisfied with his arrangements, the way they were carried out.
But as the days turn into weeks, investigators are no closer to finding the killers. Although many residents of Chantre's apartment complex reported hearing the gunshots, no one appears to have seen anything.
The biggest issue that was happening during these years in Savannah is the fact that nobody wanted to talk about crime. It was taboo.
People are afraid. People know in this community who the troublemakers are. People know who is perpetrating most of the crime, the drugs, the guns, but they're afraid to speak out for whatever reason.
Unfortunately, there's a stigma in our community and communities across the country that snitches get in ditches. And to me, it's an asinine way of thinking. Snitches help save lives.
The only thing was going through my mind was, I cannot let this be a cold case. I was like, hey, we gotta start putting up a reward, something to get folks to talk. If they didn't want to talk to us, they can talk to Crime Stoppers, call in, stay anonymous. We just wanted the killer,
The reward leads to a flood of phone calls.
Police were getting tips from all over the place and thoughts about who they thought could be involved.
People were calling, people were talking. When you really care about somebody, there's a buzz, and people were actually trying to call us and say, well, the word on the street is this person and that person. And they started making connections.
Those connections led detectives to relook at Chantray's gambling trip on the night he was killed.
There were 3 women who drove down to Brunswick with Chantray Grant that night. 2 of those women, Chantray Grant knew very well. He was friends with them within the community. He had grown up with these women. There was another woman who Chantray did not know that well.
The young woman's name was Nalante Grant.
He took her with him because she was a friend of another friend, and he paid for everything that night because she didn't have any money.
I wasn't surprised that he shared his money because Puff is a kind-hearted person. All you had to do was ask if you needed it.
Investigators obtained Nalante's contact information, and after obtaining a warrant for her phone records, detectives find the breakthrough they've been looking for.
From the time that Chantray Grant won the money to the time they returned to Savannah, Nalante was in communication via text messages with someone about everything that was happening during that trip.
After several months, detectives investigating the murder of Savannah community leader Chantray Grant finally have a person of interest in the case. 24-year-old Nalante Grant, who was part of the group who'd gone gambling with Chantray the night he was killed.
Nalante knew that Chantray had won big on the riverboat, and Nalante was in constant communication with somebody, and the victim was attacked. Does this necessarily mean that she was involved? No, but it's highly suspicious.
It's like any crime drama you would watch on TV. The stage was being set that night for his demise.
Investigators' suspicions seemed to be confirmed when they discover who Nalante had been texting on her way back to Savannah.
A man by the name of Osha Dunham. They were acquaintance. And this is who she was communicating with the entire night.
Police are already familiar with 25-year-old Osha Dunham, a career criminal with an extensive rap sheet.
He was the polar opposite of Chantray Grant. He was known for a history of crime, robbery cases, aggravated assault cases, shootings. They knew he had a history of gang activity. So definitely Osha Dunham was someone that they wanted to closely look at.
Gangs are something normally associated with larger urban areas, but they can be found anywhere there is poverty, even a town like Savannah.
We don't have the traditional gangs that exist in New York, LA, Chicago. Those gangs have very, very clear structures, very clear hierarchy. They have rules for how they engage. They have rules for who they don't engage.
These are homegrown gang members who follow their own agenda. They follow their own strategy when it comes to crime.
It's an issue the city has been struggling to deal with for decades, but there are no easy solutions.
At one point during 2017, the city reached out to the federal government and hired a counterterrorism expert out of Philadelphia to come in to try to help quell the violence that the gang activity brought to the city.
There have been a lot of studies done by experts in regards to gangs and kids and violence. The studies have found that when kids have mentors, when they're involved with anti-gang programs and community development resources that help them to see another way, that it really does lessen the likelihood of them getting involved in gangs.
It's exactly the kind of work Chantre was involved in.
He works with young kids. You know, we had to give them a way to channel some of this negative energy, you know, making their self-worth.
He wanted the kids to have better, have better opportunities and better chances in life. To let them know, hey, you don't have to turn to the streets. There's other people out here that love you. That was the main point he was trying to get across.
Osha Dunham was a gang member Chantre couldn't have reached. At 25, he was already dedicated to a life of crime. And his connection to Nalante Grant makes him a perfect suspect for Savannah police.
They felt that they were one step closer to solving this case. They knew Osha Dunham very well. They knew about his history with violence.
Law enforcement officers are always looking for connections. And oftentimes, one investigation can help aid other investigations. And so sometimes we can clear 2 or 3 murders from one murder.
On July 8th, 2018, police are called to the scene of a shooting in Yamacraw Village. 2 men, Rashomon Miller and Virgil Wright, have been injured.
Police were on that scene collecting the evidence, collecting shell casings, and they discovered when they ran it through their system that this gun was registered to Chantre Grant.
This was a huge break in the case. That means that whoever was involved with this new shooting was also involved with the Chantre Grant killing.
But the violence didn't end there. 2 weeks later, on July 25th, there was another shooting using Chantre's gun. This time, the victim, Robert Lee Jr., does not survive.
It had started as a robbery, and it ended with a young gentleman losing his life. Phone records, shell casings, they all led back to one suspect, and that was Osha Dunham. He was the one connecting factor to not only Chantre Grant's case, but all these other shootings.
Investigators must track Osha Dunham down before more bodies are left in his tracks.
I've talked to gang members who've committed crimes, and they've told me that once you kill once, that it's easy to kill again.
Prosecuting gang members can sometimes present unique challenges for law enforcement. They may know where to look for suspects, but convincing gang members to turn on one of their own is another story.
For a lot of these kids, the gangs are the only family they've ever known. It's not just a group of people doing crimes together. Oftentimes, these are brothers and sisters who have been there for each other when no one else was. Kids need a place to belong no matter what city they live in. Gangs can provide that, but unfortunately, it always leads to violence.
The investigation into the murder of Chantre Grant is now entering its 9th month. No suspects have been arrested yet, and to friends and family, it's beginning to look like the city has given up on the case.
Savannah police weren't talking to the media. Apparently, they weren't talking to Chantre Grant's family because at one point, members of Chantre Grant's family called a news conference wanting the public, wanting Savannah police to know they had hired an attorney to set up a parallel investigation into the death of their loved one.
My task has always been to get justice for Chantre Grant. In the beginning, that task involved bringing public awareness to the need to ascertain the identities of the wrongdoers that killed him.
What they don't know is that Savannah police are already close to catching the perpetrators. Phone records prove that Osha Dunham received several messages from Nalante Grant leading up to Chantre's murder.
Chantre Grant was not flashy at all when it came to his winnings because he would win so often. It would be second nature for him to go to Brunswick, win big, and come back and not speak at all about it. The issue was the people who were around him, they were talking about the money that he was winning.
It's possible that Nalante knew that Chantre would be an easy mark. That may have been why she wanted to go with him that night.
Chantre was so trusting. Anybody could have gone with him that night. Any of his friends and friends of friends. He just wanted to have a good time. And this is the way he did it. And his demise was being plotted from the very second that he pulled out of his parking lot at his apartment. The stage was being set for his murder.
She was in contact with O'Shea Dunham throughout the night. Informed Dunham that Chantre Grant had a pretty successful evening.
Even after Chantre shared some of his winnings with Nalante, she went through with the plan to kill him.
Chantre was a marked man and did not even recognize that.
She didn't have to set him up. If she asked, he would have gave it to her. That's the person he is. If she needed it, he would have gave it to her. She didn't even have to have him killed like that.
And Osha Dunham was the perfect accomplice.
The investigation revealed that both Nalante Grant and O'Shea Dunham had gang ties.
Osha Dunham was your worst nightmare when it came to crime in a city like Savannah. He led a crime spree for months and months and months.
A task force, including the Violent Crimes Unit, the city's gang unit, as well as the district attorney's office and the FBI, puts together a 108-count indictment, which formally charges Osha Dunham and Nalante Grant for the murder of Chantre Grant.
One of the most critical points in the Chantre Grant murder case was the actual indictment, because the community was then able to see the people involved that perpetuated this crime, orchestrated this event that led up to his death, and were able to see the people who were behind this act of violence.
In addition, Dunham is charged with the other shootings involving Chantre's gun.
We were floored, number one, because after all these months, finally an arrest, but shocking at the same time to see that Osha Dunham was connected to all these other different violent cases where so many other people had lost their lives.
The task force also identifies and indicts 4 other gang members in connection with the recent crime spree.
It took detectives a while to make arrests because they were trying to gather all the evidence. And it took them connecting the dots to bring this whole investigation together. And they wanted to make sure that they were able to bring down the entire gang involved with these shootings.
On Thursday, March 14, 2019, Osha Dunham, Nalante Grant, and the 4 additional gang members are arrested.
When they called me, they told me that they had a suspect in custody. It was like the best news I ever got.
But will the arrest take this dangerous group of criminals off the streets for good? After investigating for almost a year, Savannah police have finally arrested 2 suspects for the murder of Chantre Grant. along with 4 other suspects in connection with recent gang activity in Savannah.
So when we received the indictment, there were 6 people that were charged, the O'Shea Dunham and Nalante Grant, in addition to 4 others.
O'Shea Dunham and Nalante Grant stand trial for the murder of Chantre Grant in January of 2020.
Covering the trial, as you could imagine, when you're dealing with a homicide, you have the family members of the victim, you have the family members of the defendant that's on trial. And it was very emotional for both families to not only be in such close proximity, but to have to hear the evidence leading up to the death of someone they loved.
It was hard because some of those people didn't even show no remorse. And when we walked through the door in the courtroom, the people that were supporting them act like we did something wrong.
Prosecutors describe O'Shea as a one-man hurricane who'd shot Chantre 5 times in the back before stealing his gun to commit a string of other violent crimes.
They showed evidence that O'Shea Dunham took photographs of himself flashing large sums of money in Chantre Grant's gun. The photo was taken 1 day after Chantre's murder.
They also drew a roadmap using cell phone GPS that put O'Shea at the scene of each shooting. Phone records also prove that he'd conspired with Nalante Grant to kill Chantre.
Nalante was someone who lived in the same development that Chantre did.
I didn't know she was on the scene until we went to court. And one of the witnesses said that she was there, that she was on the scene with them the night that it happened. And the day in court that they showed the pictures were the hardest for me. And to find out what really happened, he didn't even get a chance. He got out of his truck and y'all started shooting him. He really didn't know it was coming.
Defense attorneys argue that the state's evidence against O'Shea are largely circumstantial, and they cannot prove that Nalante was involved in any way.
The phone records can prove that Nalante and O'Shea were talking, but they can't show what they were talking about. They apparently deleted all the texts that they had sent, thinking that the detectives would not be able to know what they were talking about. You don't always have to have a smoking gun to win a case. You'd be surprised at how many cases are won on just circumstantial evidence alone.
On January 15th, 2020, the jury returns its verdict.
They didn't come back with the verdict until about 7 or 8, but everybody sat there and just waited. It was like family members got off from work, everybody came up, we just sat there, ordered pizza, and we sat there and we just waited so that we can hear the verdict. And it was like the best feeling ever when they told us, said guilty.
O'Shea Dunham is sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 315 years without the possibility of parole.
O'Shea Dunham ended up stealing Chantre's gun and created havoc subsequent to shooting Chantre. And that's why he ended up receiving a lot more time than just 2 life sentences.
Nalante Grant was also found guilty and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole.
I thought he should have got the death penalty, be honest. That she shouldn't have got parole, life with parole.
Chantre Grant's killers have been brought to justice. But his friends, family, and the entire city of Savannah will be dealing with this loss for years to come.
When you have a life that's taken so swiftly, you never get closure because the void will always be there. You may get peace to a certain extent when you find out the killers were brought to justice, but the void will always remain.
And not only did they steal the money, they stole his life. They stole him from this community.
We still hurt. Some of us ain't even healed yet.
I think what we miss most about him is just his presence. I think now his spirit, his legacy is now shared among all of us. We're all speaking out a lot more and a lot louder because of Puff.
Chantre Grant stood unafraid in his own neighborhood, and he inspired his community. He inspired the young men and women that knew him, that loved him. He inspired them to not be afraid to speak out, to stand for what's right, to speak out against violence. You don't need a bullhorn. Speak up, stand up, tell what is right. And that legacy lives on till today in Savannah.
The city of Atlanta has a rich and storied history, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement. Today, Atlanta is a sprawling hub of industry with the world's busiest airport. But where there is big business, there is also corruption. And for one local politician, a valiant attempt to clean it all up would lead to a shocking crime. Burned to the ground at the end of the Civil War, Atlanta quickly rose from the ashes to become a major metropolis. It's now headquarters to some of the world's largest companies and boasts elite universities like Emory, Georgia Tech, Morehouse, and Spelman. But Atlanta's rise to prominence has also been complicated by a history of racial tension.
The situation was a lot different back in the 1960s. A lot different. All goes back to the race riots and the trauma of all that.
We have a lot of history here. We have the birthplace of Dr. Martin Luther King. We also have Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he and his forefathers taught at. Neighborhoods are integrated. It's not in a separation as it was previously. So to me, it's much more unity.
Nearly 6 million people live in the greater metropolitan area, stretching out over 30 miles.
Atlanta is one of the largest cities in the U.S., and it has truly become what everybody calls it now as the Black Mecca.
Wherever you go, it's history all around. And it's expanding more and more. We also have different businesses coming here.
Over the past 30 years, Atlanta has become a major center for music, filmmaking, and cultural events.
It's huge here in Atlanta. I'm proud of the fact that we've got 3 of the top HBCUs in the country. Atlanta is considered the new Hollywood, specifically the new Black Hollywood. It's an amazing city in regards to culture and arts and restaurants and fashion and economics. It's a great city.
But all of Atlanta's explosive growth would come with a darker side effect of corruption, scandal, and violence. And one local leader would pay the ultimate price. December 15th, 2000. Just after 11 p.m., the DeKalb County Police Department receives a frantic 911 call from a woman named Phyllis Brown. She says her husband, 46-year-old Derwin Brown, has just been shot in the front yard.
There had been neighbors that had called 911 as well because they had heard the gunshots, and you could hear sirens in the background coming to the home.
First responders raced to the scene, but unfortunately, it's already too late.
There was no way that paramedics were going to revive him. He had been shot 12 times and was bleeding out.
I got this phone call. I said, Derwin has been shot. I never will forget. It was raining so hard, you couldn't hardly see off the hood of the car. When I walked in the hospital, this nurse met me and said he didn't make it. It's like something just went blank.
In a city as large as Atlanta, shootings are an unfortunate reality. But this one is immediately cause for concern, because Derwin Brown is the newly elected sheriff of DeKalb County.
They shocked, veteran law enforcement, because this kind of stuff don't happen.
You would think that, certain people would be untouchable. How is that possible?
But is this just a random act of violence or something more sinister?
They shot my dad like 11, 12, 13 times. In my driveway. On my mother's birthday. It's cold-blooded.
Born on June 22nd, 1954, Derwin Brown spent his formative years in Hempstead, New York. And from before he'd even graduated high school, he seemed destined for a life of politics.
From the era that he was born and grew up in Long Island, civil rights and Black Panther movement and all these things that are positive, it helped him be a strong individual to stand up and fight.
He's always had that seriousness about him, and he's always had pride in who he was.
Every summer, Derwin and his siblings would go to Atlanta to spend time with their aunt. And it was on one of these trips that he met the woman he would eventually marry.
His aunt attended the same church that my mother attended, so that's how they met.
The reason why she really resonated with him was because she was as strong as he was.
My mother was from Atlanta, born and raised, 4th Ward as they call it. She was gorgeous, intelligent, and very feisty.
It didn't take long for Derwin to realize that Phyllis was the one.
He would talk about dates and when he and Phyllis would go out, and he would say, man, I had met other women, but I had never seen anyone like Phyllis.
People were a little hesitant about the relationship because it moved so quickly, but they were in love.
After completing a degree in sociology and criminal justice, Derwin moved to the Peach State to be with Phyllis for good. The two got married in 1977 and settled in the town of Decatur to start a family.
Decatur is a small town in a big county. We had some of the wealthiest people in Georgia and then some of the more challenged people. It was a wonderful place to live and to raise a family. You would see community leaders of all shapes, sizes, and colors get together for the better of the community.
It was beautiful. My parents welcomed other kids, so something was always going on in the Brown household. People would come over for conversations, so it was exciting.
In addition to raising 5 children, Derwin pursued a career in public service as a youth counselor for troubled teens.
He would go to detention centers and also have events in the community, finding strong African-American men to mentor the young African-American boys that needed it.
People would spend the night over our house. I didn't even know who they were, but I knew they were somebody in need, somebody who needed to see probably what we were going to see the next day.
He's always been an involved person, never the type of person to take the back seat or kind of sit back and let things happen. He was always in front.
But since 1979, Derwin's primary occupation was as a member of law enforcement. As one of DeKalb County's first black patrol officers, he quickly rose through the ranks.
He spent a lot of hours out of his life there studying to complete the sergeant's test, the lieutenant's test, the captain's test. He run his own drug task force.
My father probably worked every department that they have at the police department, from narcotics, He did go away to the FBI Academy for training.
He was committed to the DeKalb County Police Department, just as he was committed to our family. The DeKalb County Police Department was like our family, because he was a part of them and he was a part of us, so he made us a part of them.
Derwin also earned a reputation for speaking truth to power.
In order to get promoted and move up, there's an exam process. And Derwin saw how unfair it was, because inside of that, you need a merit-based system so that there's equity for everybody, not just minorities, but for everybody. So that if you made sergeant or lieutenant or captain, you could see and expect to receive certain step increases, money, rank, and all the things that go along with that.
So, after more than 20 years on the police force, it seemed right that he become sheriff.
He just saw how things were ran, and, he just wasn't comfortable with it, wasn't happy, but he always vowed to go back and make a change.
He was glowing. All his friends, close and not, they were all proud of him because they knew what type of man he was. He was a good man, put in a good position to be able to help a lot of people.
But he would never get that chance. 3 days before he was to be sworn in, Derwin has been murdered in his own driveway.
He was everything to us. Our family fell apart that night, literally.
Minutes away from downtown Atlanta is the quiet enclave of Decatur, Georgia. While homicides in the metro area remain high, this small community is safe by comparison.
Decatur is an old, wealthy enclave. It's progressive, probably more liberal than a lot of places in Georgia.
It's a close-knit community where everybody's fooling everybody. You can actually walk to school, go to different parks, and feel safe doing that.
It's one of the many reasons why the murder of newly elected Sheriff Derwin Brown comes as such a surprise.
The neighborhoods were shocked. Everybody loved him. Everybody was very proud of him. And now it was just like, what just happened? It's over before he even gets started.
It was a surreal moment. I mean, my phone started ringing off the hook with colleagues and friends and saying, did you hear Derwin Brown was murdered? Derwin Brown was murdered in his driveway. Who in the world would have done this?
Within hours of his death, the entire DeKalb County Police Force has mobilized for investigation.
It was a cold Georgia night. I distinctly remember the crime scene technicians taking different colored flags as they would find a piece of evidence. And I remember there being a lot of red flags. And I asked one of the CSI, I said, why are there so many red flags? And they said, well, that's for each shell casing. And I went, my gosh, there were a lot of shots fired.
17 shell casings are collected in total. They were fired from a Tech-9 semi-automatic pistol. Another clue that this case was going to be unusual.
A Tech-9, seemed pretty gangster,
The Tech-9 is a very unusual weapon of choice. It can have up to 22 rounds, and it's usually associated with organized crime and street gangs. So it was very telling for the police when they discovered that that type of weapon was used to assassinate Derwin Brown.
It was pretty obvious. This wasn't a random shooting at all. I mean, this was a kill you dead shooting.
However, the shell casings are the only pieces of evidence Derwin's killer left behind. Investigators immediately issue a BOLO alert for the gun before sitting down with Derwin's wife Phyllis to get her account of what happened. Phyllis tells police that she and the children had just come home after celebrating Derwin's graduation from a sheriff's training program.
The Peace Officer Standards Training Program is an intensive 6-week course, and you stay there at the location. It involves management, things that are not typically taught to your standard police officer. Phyllis and Brandy, their daughter, had taken a separate car down there.
It was exciting. You know, I can just remember just crying. I was just so happy for him, you know. There was a celebration that some of the workers from the campaign had put together. We came home for a brief stint and went straight to the celebration.
He was to be sworn in the next Monday morning, so there were a lot of well wishers there. Derwin was the last person to leave about 11 o'clock that night.
A little while later, Phyllis and her son Robert heard Derwin's car pull into the driveway. He would never make it inside.
I remember Phyllis telling me that, they heard his door close and knew that he was out front. And moments later, bullets started raining down.
It sounded like firecrackers. And then it registered it's not firecrackers. And so she looks out the window and she sees my dad's car.
She peeked out the window and totally expected that Derwin was going to be crouched behind one of the cars, that he too had heard the gunshots from next door.
Derwin didn't carry a gun that often, so he probably was not armed.
When she opened the family room door, Derwin had made his way all the way to the front steps. But when she bent down, Derwin was dead.
Phyllis doesn't recall seeing anyone fleeing the area.
Most law enforcement officers, the first thing that they're going to do is talk to neighbors or witnesses or do what we consider a canvass. And that's basically talking to anybody in the area that may have witnessed something or heard something, because that information is evidence as well.
And unfortunately, there don't seem to be any other witnesses.
It's like a dead-end street. And there's only 2 houses to the right of my parents' house, and then there's that dead end.
But detectives are aware that Derwin had made plenty of enemies on his way to becoming sheriff. Especially since his election campaign promised to clean up corruption in the department.
You've heard the phrase absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's essentially what you have in the sheriff's office. It's one person being in charge of a multi-million-dollar budget, $30-40 million a year. And when you have that much authority and that much money, it's really easy to be corrupted.
We had, I believe at the time, 9 Georgia sheriffs who had been indicted and prosecuted for various acts of corruption.
Derwin Brown, this way of doing things was so phenomenal that, and doing this, he also got some other people on board with him because it was so very obvious what was going on in the sheriff's office throughout the years.
My father saw it, he investigated it, and he knew that something had to change.
In 1996, hosting the Olympics put Atlanta on the center of the world stage. But a deadly bombing would put the city on edge.
1 person was killed and 111 people were injured. The security officer that was accused and was later exonerated, he did not have anything to do with the bombing that left a bad taste in everybody's mouth.
The image of Atlanta law enforcement was left tarnished, something residents would not soon forget. DeKalb County is one of the largest and most diverse in the state of Georgia. It is also one of the more affluent. But like the city of Atlanta, DeKalb also has a complicated history.
DeKalb is made up of two communities. There's South DeKalb and there's North DeKalb. North DeKalb is predominantly white. South DeKalb is predominantly black.
The county is also home to a monolithic Confederate memorial carving called Stone Mountain.
Most people know that DeKalb County or Stone Mountain is the foundation of the birthplace of the KKK. So there's always been a diversity division within DeKalb County.
They were trying to get it removed, but people voted against it. We still have some problems, but it's not like it was.
DeKalb County law enforcement has also been a notorious hotbed of corruption.
Everybody that's been in law enforcement and lived in DeKalb County any length of time already know about that sheriff department. We talking about 50 years back. Every sheriff of DeKalb County has gone to prison or jail. That is how deep the corruption is.
It had such a good old boys mentality and spirit. I mean, if you had money, you could exchange money for contracts and favors. Everybody knew that.
By the late 1990s, however, political power in the area had begun to change hands.
What happens in communities when you start seeing a demographic shift, usually the political shift follows it. You had a sort of white political structure that was governing white county commissioners and a white sheriff, and that all changed. We elected an African American.
A lot of African Americans were very encouraged by that. They said, it's finally our opportunity to be successful in politics and in commerce.
When Derwin Brown won his bid to become sheriff, he vowed to clean up the office once and for all.
Derwin Brown was also aware of the fact that it was corruption in that department because he was once a part of that department and knew the ins and outs of that. Derwin Brown also was very dedicated to his job, very dedicated to his family, and very dedicated to the people of DeKalb County.
You're fighting for your people and you're fighting for what's right, and he didn't waver from that.
So as news of his murder becomes a national story, DeKalb County gets an interim sheriff, and investigators are feeling the pressure to find his killer.
They sought to bring in some of the top law enforcement individuals within those different organizations, the GBI, the FBI, the DOJ, to make sure an objective investigation was going to be conducted because they knew all eyes were on them.
I got a phone call, which midday following morning said, hey, come to headquarters, chief's from the task force, and you're in it.
We knew it was not domestic. We knew it was not a robbery gone bad. There are multiple people with motives to assassinate the sheriff-elect.
And one of the first people the task force decides to look into is the former sheriff, 59-year-old Sidney Dorsey.
Because that's who Derwin Brown defeated in the election.
Dorsey was the first black elected sheriff, I think, in this county.
Before running for office in DeKalb County, Mr. Dorsey had been a detective in the Atlanta Police Department. His claim to fame came during the Atlanta missing and murdered children's case, where he was one of the detectives.
The Atlanta child murder case terrorized the city from 1979 to 1981. Dorsey was one of the lead investigators and also played a role in reopening the case after Wayne Williams was convicted.
He felt that there were other parties or individuals that could have been involved with all the child murders, that it was not an individual person. And he was one of the lead advocates to have the case reopened after Wayne Williams was sentenced.
As his career progressed, he developed a reputation for being a bit of a cowboy.
One time he fired his weapon at the Atlanta Police Department inside the squad room. There's a story that he shot a kid that was hiding underneath a house. And he shot a man and killed him in a dispute at a gas pump.
One witness said he basically executed the guy. Started out as a murder charge, went to manslaughter, and then eventually, went away.
When he was elected sheriff in 1996, Dorsey seemed to build on that reputation as a forceful leader.
The thing I remembered about him the most was his persona. His was like larger than life whenever you would be around him.
He dressed in a uniform that had the epaulets of a South American dictator.
But 4 years later, as the 2000 election unfolded, news broke that he was under investigation by the GBI for abusing his power for personal gain.
Sidney Dorsey was using some of the prison labor for his wife's personal home or friends' personal projects at home.
Using county resources and, deputies to go to another state just to fix your daughter's car. And the deputy signed to pick up his son, at school, every day.
Not maybe the biggest, but very important, was that he was using sheriff deputies as a part of his security company.
Amazingly, in Georgia, a sheriff can own a private security firm. The sheriff can stock that private security firm with deputies from his sheriff's department in uniform.
So that pretty much sealed Sidney Dorsey's fate in terms of getting reelected.
And as detectives dig further into the GBI's corruption investigation, they find something else.
It was during that time that a female informed me that the sheriff had offered her a position as the first African-American female bondswoman in DeKalb County, but she had a tough price to pay for that position.
Sheriff Dorsey was taking $10,000 a month just to keep a bonding company, inside his jail. And he was making her have sex with him.
Surprisingly, she claims that Dorsey didn't have any plans to give up his title.
She was talking to Mr. Dorsey about what was he going to do when Derwin Brown became sheriff. And in her words, she said that Sheriff Dorsey told her that Derwin Brown would never become sheriff. And she said, "Why do you say that, Sidney?" And he went like this and didn't say anything else.
The residents of Decatur, Georgia, are used to living in the shadow of Metro Atlanta. But now, the town has been thrust into the spotlight with the murder of Sheriff Derwin Brown.
As you can imagine, once this murder occurred, there was incredible, intense publicity. Not just here in Georgia, but nationwide, New York Times, and Europe as well.
The community of DeKalb County found out that Sidney Dorsey was a suspect through one of the local media reporters that had leaked that he was under GBI investigation.
They were looking at people that were tied to the sheriff's department that possibly were losing money or contracts or jobs.
On January 4th, 2001, the investigators questioned Dorsey. He denies any involvement in the murder and the corruption scandal that caused him to lose the election.
He said that he and I didn't do anything that other sheriffs didn't do. He really, really believed that he wasn't corrupt. He was just doing what all the other sheriffs had done.
He surrounded himself with people who stood up, and he held news conferences to talk about how the Cox organization, which was the owner of the television station I worked for, had racist intent and wanted him removed from office.
Dorsey acknowledges his affair with the bondswoman, but denies her claim that he intended to prevent Derwin Brown from taking office.
His answer was, I would be crazy to do such a thing when the focus would be directly on me.
Sidney Dorsey's alibi was his wife, Sherry. She confirmed that he was with her during the time period that the crime actually occurred.
Mr. Dorsey was with his wife. There's no question about that.
But there was zero evidence that he would have done it, and it was unthinkable to think he would have done it.
But as we all know, spouses can be dishonest and can lie. That really didn't mean anything because he was a smart and savvy enough guy to have planned this and planned it in a way where nothing pointed back to him.
With Sheriff Dorsey seemingly in the clear, investigators turned to someone else who stood to lose from Derwin Brown's election. 35-year-old Patrick Cuffey.
Cuffey was a deputy at the Cobb County Sheriff's Department under Sidney Dorsey.
Patrick Cuffey was from the Virgin Islands. He met Sidney Dorsey when Sidney Dorsey was a resource officer with the Atlanta Police Department in Patrick Cuffey's middle school. Patrick Cuffey immediately became enamored with Sidney Dorsey and wanted to become a police officer.
He was the number one person that was going to be fired from the department. It seemed like everywhere that there were issues of corruption pointed to the sheriff, somehow Cuffey was involved.
Like his boss, Cuffey had also been investigated for corruption.
I had been investigating Cuffey for stealing money from the sheriff's department by putting in bogus overtime sheets.
He was saying he was working 90 hours a week, which he wasn't doing. But since, they say he was Dorsey's boy, he was able to get away with it.
He's making $100,000 a year, and then he had to go to work.
He had been promised a position, a new position within law enforcement in DeKalb County. So it's not a leap to think that he would be involved with the assassination, because when Sidney Dorsey was not reelected, it killed everybody's hopes of all these jobs and money that they had been promised.
When investigators questioned Patrick Cuffey, he's hostile towards them.
He refused to sit down. He refused to take his sheriff's hat off. He refused to cooperate. The anger and venom in his voice was very apparent.
Patrick Cuffey did have an alibi. He was with friends during the murder.
He said there were 4 of them at his house lifting weights.
With 2 of the most likely suspects cleared, investigators are running out of leads.
To be honest with you, the case was dead in the water. We had no evidence that, other than our gut feelings and about who was involved.
As the weeks turn into months, the task force conducts more than 300 interviews and posts a reward for $71,500. Then, in March of 2001, 3 months after Derwin Brown's murder, investigators finally get a break in the case when their number 2 suspect pops back up on their radar.
Patrick Cuffey had lost his job at the sheriff's department, so he had no means of income. And so he had connections to people that sold marijuana. He made arrangements with some people he knew to transport a bale of marijuana from the islands into the States. And Patrick Cuffey had to come up with the seed money to get the marijuana into the country. It was the last money he had. He got double-crossed. The people that he did the dope deal with never delivered the dope.
There's a shootout at Patrick Cuffey's house. Multiple shots were fired. And in the middle of all of this, one person was killed.
The police went out and arrested Patrick Cuffey.
Desperate to avoid jail, Cuffey tells the task force he's ready to come clean about Derwin's death.
In exchange for complete immunity, Mr. Cuffey would provide us information about who was responsible for the murder of Sheriff-elect Derwin Brown.
Sidney Dorsey was well known in Atlanta for his work on what became known as the Atlanta child murders. In 1979, the bodies of 2 missing 14-year-old boys were found in a wooded area.
Over a 2-year period, 26 additional bodies were discovered in 2 adults. They clearly saw that there was some type of a serial killer that was active within the city of Atlanta.
Dorsey was praised for his continuing work on the unsolved cases.
So people were just stunned at the allegation that he may have been involved with Derwin Brown's assassination.
After one of the most expansive murder investigations in Georgia history, the DeKalb County Task Force finally seems to be closing in on Derwin Brown's killer. After being caught in a drug deal gone bad, former DeKalb County Deputy Patrick Cuffey has offered up a confession to avoid jail time.
So Paul Skyers worked security for Dorsey. David Ramsey worked security. Melvin Walker was a deputy. And Patrick Cuffey worked both jobs.
Melvin Walker and Patrick Cuffey had been given termination letters, and the talk was, what are we going to do, once Derwin Brown becomes sheriff?
According to Cuffey, the four decided to eliminate the problem by killing Derwin. David Ramsey provided the gun.
They actually drew straws as to see who was going to fire the murder weapon, and Melvin Walker got the short straw.
On the night of December 15th, they put their plan into action.
They hid at a house across the way from Derwin Brown. They unscrewed the light bulb so that they wouldn't be seen there.
Paul Skyers was the getaway driver. He stayed in the car when Ramsey, Cuffey, and Walker went to the house.
When they seen my father walking down the driveway, that's when they pursued him.
Walker had the Intratec 9, and Walker fired all the shots.
After they killed Derwin Brown, they jumped in the car and they went back to Patrick Cuffey's home. Their alibi was going to be that they were all at Patrick Cuffey's.
But that's not all. Although Cuffey and his accomplices all had reason to want Derwin Brown eliminated, he claims they were actually acting on the orders of someone else.
Shortly after the election, Sidney Dorsey called Patrick Cuffey to his home, and Sidney Dorsey wrote down on a piece of paper, "Kill Derwin Brown."
Cuffey read the note, and Dorsey took the note back and ate it.
Cuffey told me that Dorsey had convinced them that he was truly a person that was harming the community. And the night they killed Derwin Brown, they hated him. They wanted to end his life.
Paul Skyers is the first to be arrested. Like Cuffey, he makes a deal for immunity in exchange for his testimony. He even tells investigators where they can find the murder weapon.
He had dismantled the Intratec 9, threw it down a sewer, and we were able to bring the parts back up. Unfortunately, we were not able to assemble it to fire it, but there was an Intratec 9 that certainly could have been the murder weapon.
On December 17th of 2001, almost a year to the day after Derwin Brown was killed, Melvin Walker and David Ramsey are indicted. But on November 30th, Sidney Dorsey surprises everyone by turning himself in.
They made him do a perk walk, and he was in the orange jumpsuit and shackled.
That was a sad day in DeKalb County history. A sitting sheriff assassinates or orchestrates the assassination of an incoming sheriff who beat him out of office.
While Dorsey continues to fight the charges, Melvin Walker and David Ramsey are tried in 2002.
The strategy was first to prosecute the shooter and the accomplice based largely on the testimony of Mr. Cuffey and Mr. Skyers. We had the corroboration, we had a gun, we had the person who actually sold the Intratec 9 to Mr. Ramsey.
But their primary witness, Patrick Cuffey, unexpectedly backs out on his deal.
He was defiant, and he argued with the defense lawyers.
You're insulting my intelligence. Who are you to not believe what I am saying?
As a result, Walker and Ramsey are both acquitted.
It was a devastating blow to us. The Atlanta papers called for my resignation.
The city of Atlanta and the district attorney's office are both reeling from the shocking acquittal of the two suspects in the murder of Sheriff Derwin Brown.
As a reporter, I had no confidence that Sidney Dorsey was going to be convicted. I felt as though, without physical evidence, the jury would send a man to prison for the rest of his life.
In the weeks leading up to the trial, Dorsey's lawyer asked for a change of venue.
The pretrial publicity in this community and the Atlanta media market was overwhelming. And I think it would have been hard to get a fair and unbiased jury from either side.
The request is granted, and the trial is moved to Albany, Georgia, 180 miles south of DeKalb County.
Albany, Georgia. It's a very, very different place than DeKalb County, Georgia. It's a much more rural community. Law and order is much more respected there.
In June of 2002, Sidney Dorsey's trial begins, and prosecutors employ a new strategy. Instead of focusing solely on the murder, they include charges of widespread corruption as well.
We had two trials. The first case was going to be the racketeering. So we spent the first week and a half solely trying a racketeering case.
They had the evidence that they needed to be able to charge him with corruption and racketeering. They just didn't have what they needed in regards to being able to charge him with the murder of Derwin Brown.
By the time Cuffey testified this time, the jury had already made up their minds that Mr. Dorsey was corrupt. Then we just had to prove he was corrupt enough to plan this murder.
They presented a much more toned-down Cuffey. He wasn't as quarrelsome, and they didn't change the case at all in terms of how the murder went down.
However, Dorsey's defense pokes holes in the prosecution's case at every turn.
They maintained his innocence, he said. He said Cuffey lied, and I promise you he lied. And he said, and I didn't do anything that other sheriffs didn't do. I didn't do anything wrong.
The jurors felt like they couldn't almost determine who was telling the truth because there were so many lies being told.
They came back and said, we're hopelessly deadlocked. We can't reach a verdict. Judge Cynthia Becker sent the jury back in and said, try again. As they weighed the stories, it was overwhelmingly obvious that Sidney Dorsey was not only involved in the murder, but ordered the murder. And they did not want the crime to go unpunished. And about an hour and a half later, they came back and they had voted to convict Sidney Dorsey.
On July 10th, 2002, Sidney Dorsey is found guilty of the murder of Derwin Brown, as well as 11 counts of racketeering.
He was stone-faced, no reaction at all. Didn't flinch. He just took it.
There was an immediate emotional release on Phyllis's part, and I felt for her. I was so happy that she was able to have that moment.
Sidney Dorsey is sentenced to life in prison. 3 years later, Melvin Walker and David Ramsey once again face charges in the death of Derwin Brown. This time, under a federal murder for hire statute.
In the United States, you can be tried for a federal crime even if you've been acquitted of a similar charge in state court. And that's exactly what happened to Melvin Walker and David Ramsey.
Both are found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers remain free men.
It's hard for me to feel like some justice has come from it because you still got Cuffey and Skyers walking around, living their best life wherever they are.
It makes me no different because they already done killed my father. They done took the best thing I had, and it's gone. Ain't no coming back from that.
Justice may have been served, but for the people of Atlanta, it was a bittersweet victory. Derwin Brown will always be remembered as a man who died trying to make a difference in their lives.
He would have made the Cobb County Sheriff Department the role model of this whole state of Georgia.
I want people to remember the love that he had for the people. Because all in all, this was what this was all about. He wanted to make sure that the Cobb County citizens were being done right. And that's what he died for.
Memphis, Tennessee is known as the Center for Arts and Entertainment in the Deep South. But in 2010, the city lost one of its hometown heroes in a hail of gunfire. The mysterious death of the beloved NBA superstar would confound police for years and bring an entire community together in the search for justice. Built in the 1800s, atop bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, Memphis has become one of the South's fastest growing cities.
The river was a transport place, and it was world renowned for cotton and sugar. It was a place where everything came in.
Memphis, I think, is probably the world's largest small town. I mean, it's a place where people know each other. People care about each other.
I love the pace of the city. It has a lot of soul.
Part of that soul comes from the city's connection to music. Memphis is known as the birthplace of rock and roll. But decades before Elvis laid down his first track at Sun Studios, it was the home of the blues.
Memphis is what we call a chocolate city. It's 65% African American. That shapes our culture and our attitude and the way we are. The blues being founded right here in Memphis on Beale Street. People like Johnny Asen and Bobby Bland and Roscoe Gordon, B.B. King. All of these blues people made Memphis home.
Memphis has always had that good, soulful R&B music, jazz, blues, rock and roll, and it still has it to this day. You can find good music almost anywhere in this city, and we are never at a loss for some good entertainment.
Beale Street also served as an economic center for the town's black businesses. But during the Civil Rights Movement, it transformed into a hotbed of political activism.
Memphis was always sort of a calm town where civil rights was concerned. But all of that changed in the mid to late 1960s.
The sanitation workers decided to go on strike because they were paid miserably. They were treated miserably. They didn't have the proper kinds of health insurance or benefits or that a person needs to just sustain life and take care of a family.
Everybody else was involved in civil rights, coalesced around them. And they were able to get Dr. Martin Luther King to come to town to support the sanitation workers. He led a march. The march turned violent. He was criticized by the newspapers as someone who could no longer lead a peaceful demonstration. He could not let that be the last word, so he came back to do another march. And when he came back to do another march, that's when he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, right here in the city. And the city has really never got over the assassination of Dr. King.
It proved that we had a lot of work to do.
Memphis has spent the last 50 years healing the wounds caused by Dr. King's death. And there's one thing that can always bring the city together.
Memphians love basketball. It's kind of the glue that holds this town together.
It doesn't matter whether you're black or you're white when you're watching Memphis basketball. everybody's pulling for the same team. And that means a lot in this community.
In 1995, the city got their own team to root for when the Vancouver Grizzlies relocated to Memphis. One of their star players was a 6'11" center named Lorenzen Wright.
I remember when I first met Lorenzen in high school, Booker T. Washington, senior year in 1994. The coach told me, hey, go look at this kid. You're going to like what you see.
Was an outstanding player, big guy. He then decided to enroll at the University of Memphis. It was nothing but excitement.
He was huge in building that program. He was a McDonald's All-American. Everyone, you could tell this guy was going places.
While playing for the Memphis Tigers, Lorenzen met the love of his life, Shara Robinson.
Lorenzen said, I went up there to help her move her stuff in the dorm. And we started dating. Shara was gung-ho spiritually. She was ready to do ministry. She had a heart for people, salvation, particularly young ladies who were underprivileged. And that's her heart.
The relationship kind of blossomed surprisingly fast. Next thing I know, he was getting married.
Shara and Lorenzen welcomed their first child in April of 1995, and the new husband and father continued to excel on the basketball court.
They had no idea he was going to be drafted in the NBA. Then we had potential, but not necessarily had an idea he would be. And so, of course, that was the goal. And so she stayed with him through that whole route.
After wrapping up an impressive college career, Lorenzen entered the NBA draft in 1996 with his family by his side.
Everybody was in front of a TV set that night when the NBA draft went off. The seventh, they called Lorenzen Wright. Everybody screamed.
He was a first-round draft pick. Played in Los Angeles for the Clippers for a while.
After 5 years with the Clippers, Lorenzen briefly played for the Atlanta Hawks before being traded to his hometown team, the Memphis Grizzlies. The town welcomed him, Shara, and their now 4 children back home with open arms.
The fans literally packed the Forum just to see him play. After all, he's a hometown product. And it was just outstanding for him and for us, for him to be here. He's one of the giants, of Memphis basketball. He's a hometown hero.
Lorenzen was more than just a player. He was also a pillar of the community, volunteering his time and money to the city that raised him. But 2 years later, tragedy struck the Wright family when their newborn daughter, Sierra, passed away.
Sierra, who was 11 months old when she died. It was reported in the news as a SIDS death, one of these crib deaths. The whole thing was just devastating.
We grieved with him and with the family. The community just sort of wrapped its collective arms around Lorenzen.
The Wrights took comfort from their community. But in 2006, Lorenzen was traded back to Atlanta, where he would finish out the rest of his career. Shara and their 6 children remained in Memphis. Although the couple would get divorced in 2010, they remained close.
The children loved their father. They would spend whatever time they could with Lorenzen in his apartment in Atlanta.
After Shara and Lorenzen were divorced in February of 2010, they continued to be in contact, not only about the children, but also romantically as well. In fact, the children told us that Lorenzen had proposed to Shara and wanted to get married to her again, and that she had said yes.
But before Lorenzen and Shara could renew their vows, the former NBA center suddenly vanished without a trace. July 18th, 2010, Lorenzen travels to Memphis to attend his sister's baby shower.
Lorenzen was living in Atlanta at this point. So the first thing that he does when he gets back to Memphis is go around town and visit his friends before he goes to visit his kids.
My nephew, Phil, he actually picked Lorenzen up and took him over to Shara's house.
Lorenzen spends the evening with the children, and leaves before midnight. But the following day, friends realize he's not answering any of their calls.
I got a call from Sheriff Knight. Ain't heard from him. Have you heard from him? No.
Nobody pushed the panic button because it's so easy for NBA players to say, hey, let's meet in Vegas tomorrow. We'll be at the Caesars Palace. 14 to 15 guys to go jump on a plane.
And we're talking about a grown man who at that point was up in age, and how could he be missing? I mean, did he just drop out of sight? We didn't think that was possible.
As days continue to pass, his loved ones begin to worry.
After the third day of saying he's missing, me and Cheryl both were like, something wrong, this is different.
That then became the top concern in this town for everybody. Where is Lorenzen Wright? And what happened to him?
The answer would confirm everyone's worst fears.
Georgia 911, where's your emergency? Hello?
To the city of Memphis, Lorenzen Wright wasn't just a basketball player. He was a role model who proved it was possible for a hometown kid to succeed.
Unfortunately, Memphis has a huge poverty problem. That's just a fact of life.
He saw that so many people had helped him, and he wanted to help people back. I have watched him pull hundreds of dollars out of his pocket and literally give it to people. He couldn't stand to see somebody struggling when he knew he could help.
But now, the popular celebrity has disappeared without a trace. As the search continues, the city rallies around the Wright family.
There was a tremendous outpouring from the community when Lorenzen went missing.
I remember that week of suspense, the phone calls, a concern.
We just showed as much love as Memphis knows how to do.
Everyone is praying for Lorenzen's safe return, but 10 days after his disappearance, the case takes a horrific turn.
And I remember receiving a phone call from Dr. Tosi. He was the dentist for the Grizzlies team. And he said, sit down, we found your boy.
Where the body was found was actually in a remote kind of wooded area. It's where the boundaries of Memphis connect with the boundaries of two other suburban cities, Germantown and Collierville.
It was immediately clear that Lorenzen Wright had been murdered. There were 5 gunshots with 2 to the back of the head. He was still wearing all of his jewelry, so it was evident to the police that this wasn't a robbery. He was actually shot execution style.
But who would murder a hometown hero like Lorenzen? And why?
When the news broke, they finally found his body. The earth shook in Memphis. There were reporters out there from that field, the meadow where he was found. It was virtually, around the clock coverage.
It was very painful for Sherry during the time. I heard her wailing from her heart. Only time I heard her wail like that when she lost her daughter.
In looking at Lorenzen's last moments, they uncover an unsettling detail.
One of the first things that investigators did was they looked at his cell phone records, and they were astonished to find that he had tried to make a 911 call hours after he had disappeared.
Lorenzen made a panicked last-second call when he sensed that he was in grave danger, and you can hear the gunshots in the background.
Georgia 911, where's your emergency? Hello? Hello?
911 dispatcher answered the phone and did literally nothing. Didn't call the Shelby County Sheriff's Department or the Memphis Police.
There's no good explanation why the dispatcher didn't then refer it over for further investigation. It just fell between the cracks.
News of the mistake turns the city's despair into outrage.
There were just so many different emotions that came up. But the bottom line was, how could this happen? How could a clearly distressing 911 call be uninvestigated? It brought up the reaction of, well, we have a suburban city that has never really cared that much about Memphis anyway. And so there was this belief that whoever took that 911 call thought it was somebody from Memphis, and so they don't care about it.
There's a general distrust in Memphis anyway of law enforcement, so the fact that the call was not followed up on, people lost even more faith in the system.
We might not have had this murder mystery on our hands if things had happened right, because basically what it did was it gave the killers a 9-day head start.
Under mounting pressure, investigators turned to Lorenzen's friends and family for help finding his killers. They quickly discovered there was another side to the big man few people knew about.
If I wrote a book, it'd be like the Lorenzen and Sherry y'all never knew. I've seen the players over the past 7 years. If they're not balanced in the Lord and they're balanced with their family, they can lose themselves. I believe Lorenzen began to lose himself.
Lorenzen had between 4 to 8 other women on the side and in various parts of the country.
And that's not all. Lorenzen's ex-wife, Shara, also suspects he'd gotten involved in the Memphis drug trade.
There were a couple of instances that occurred prior to Lorenzen going missing. Lorenzen Jr. had reported that 2 individuals had approached him in the parking lot after school in a threatening manner and asked where his father was. And then there was another incident reported by Shara Wright that individuals had come to the home looking for Lorenzen.
I got the phone call from her the day of, and she was frantic about it because there was threats against the kids. She said, I got to call him and contact. I don't know what he into, and I ain't gonna hurt my babies. And that probably about 3-4 days before he ended up missing.
Did Lorenzen Wright get in over his head with the wrong people?
There's a history of athletes being involved in drug activity. Maybe he was in debt to some people. Maybe this was a drug deal that had gone bad. Maybe the Lorenzen that we knew was not the Lorenzen in reality.
The first 48 hours after any murder investigation are the most important. That's when your witnesses' memories are most fresh. The evidence is fresh. A witness can usually give you a solid description of a suspect a couple hours after an incident. A week or so later, not so much. On top of that, evidence gets destroyed the longer you wait. DNA, fingerprints, security tapes gets harder to collect. As a detective, you have to make split-second decisions. And with every waking moment, your suspect is getting further and further away. In the case of Lorenzen Wright, detectives were a full 9 days behind, so they had to play some serious catch-up.
Memphis isn't a town many would associate with violent crime. But in 2010, the city's murder rate was nearing an all-time high as authorities grappled with an escalating drug problem.
Drugs play a significant role in crime culture in Memphis. It's been said that there are 2 causes of crime in Memphis. The first is drugs, the second is women. So virtually all homicides in Memphis are a result of one or the other.
We have a lot of people in this community who don't care about their fellow human beings and are willing to commit crimes and even try to take somebody's life over nothing.
Now, it looks like former NBA star Lorenzen Wright might be the latest victim of the drug trade.
Shira did express fear at what Lorenzen might or might not have been doing, whether he was dealing in drugs. She didn't know, but she was concerned.
These mysterious hitmen with trench coats and guns in their waistbands are showing up at her house and at Lorenzen Junior School and other places looking for Lorenzen. So what does that mean? It means that somehow he's crossed these individuals and they have a score to settle.
As detectives begin digging into Lorenzen's past, they make a startling discovery.
Lorenzen made about $55 million throughout his career. But in 2008, he started running into financial problems.
To make some quick cash, he'd sold a few of his luxury cars. The buyer was a dealer in a local drug cartel.
In the last months of Lorenzen's life, he was involved in these car transactions where he sold cars to Bobby Cole. Bobby Cole was a family friend who was kind of a race car hobbyist who was also a drug distributor.
Bobby Cole is connected to Craig Pettis, who's a crime lord basically here in Memphis. He's infamous for dealing in cocaine.
Craig Pettis is a huge name around here, very infamous as a Mexico to Memphis drug cartel, murderous gang. You didn't mess with the Pettis gang because you would get whacked if you did.
And it looked like the cars might have had something to do with Lorenzen's murder.
The thing is that Bobby Cole never transferred ownership into his name. He left them, they were registered to Lorenzen Wright. In the law enforcement world, people who investigate drug cartels, that's what's known as a nominee. It's basically a money laundering operation where you pay the money, you get the car, but it never appears in your name.
The cars also gave Cole a way to secretly move drugs. But the cars were seized during a search by federal prosecutors for an unrelated case.
They lose the drugs, so maybe they come after Lorenzen for the money. Lorenzen tries to make it right, but the drug cartel ends up sending a hitman anyway.
Career law enforcement think it's a plausible thing, and there's reasons for that too, because the way he was shot. I mean, who would do something like that but a drug organization, right?
The speculation was that they came from Atlanta. They were looking for Lorenzen. 7 days, they could be in Timbuktu.
The former police chief here, he's talking about how close the murder scene was to the airport. And he says he could almost imagine these guys flying in from Mexico, going and killing Lorenzen, getting back in a plane and disappearing into the night forever.
But without any hard evidence, investigators hit a dead end.
Police were getting nowhere. They had no answers, no information about who these men supposedly were. And so the frustrations started to set in.
There was a lot of speculation, but there were no concrete leads. For years and years, there were no suspects.
We've never had a murder mystery like this in the city. This is the one. And we don't know what happened to Lorenzen. We still wondered with each anniversary that came up. July of 2011, July of 2012, 13.
However, by the fall of 2014, suspicions begin to stir around a new suspect.
Lorenzen was smart. He knew Shara would take care of his kids. So he cut $1 million life insurance policy with her name on it. And when that policy came in, she took $150,000. Bought a home outright, paid about $20,000 and went to a trip to New York to all the kids.
Was it possible Lorenzen's ex-wife had killed him for the insurance money?
People were openly saying, you need to look at Shara, something's fishy. They got divorced, and then he's murdered just months later. Clearly, I think there's a motive there.
During their marriage, Shara and Lorenzen Wright had been one of Memphis's most recognizable power couples.
People wanted them at their parties, at their gatherings. Anywhere they went out in public, they were noticed.
But now, rumors are spreading that Shara could be involved in her ex-husband's murder.
There were a lot of people who were saying that she's just not being honest about this, that she knew more than what she was telling.
That was open discussion on talk shows in Memphis. People on the radio. People who even knew her better than I did.
There were rumors spreading throughout Memphis. And when the insurance money came up, it made everybody in Memphis go, hold up, what's really going on?
The $1 million insurance policy isn't the only thing that makes investigators suspicious.
By that time, a lot of the accounts had come out about her having a bonfire in the middle of July in her backyard.
Was Shara destroying evidence, or just enjoying a summer night in her own backyard?
What Shara said was she had an outdoor chimenea, like an outdoor ceramic fireplace that she would light every night just for the ambiance of it. So it wasn't a bonfire per se. It was just an outdoor chimenea that she would light all months of the year.
You want to give her the benefit of the doubt, too, because she's portraying herself as a kind of a grieving mother. There was just that uncertainty.
Witnesses say she had a bonfire on the day of Lorenzen's disappearance. It was 93 degrees in Memphis. Unless you're trying to get rid of evidence, nobody has a bonfire in the middle of July.
Shara only adds to the controversy when she publishes her debut novel in 2015, titled Mr. Tell Me Anything.
It's a fictionalized account that's essentially based on her relationship with Lorenzen Wright. It's a woman that is dealing with a philandering husband who is abusive and his subsequent murder.
It's just bizarre that it's so close to the actual story of their life. The parallels are just uncanny. When you get into some of the volatile nature of the relationship, that's when it gets really interesting. It's almost like a confession, that written probably partly in code. O.J. Simpson wrote a book where he said, "If I had done it." This was a "if I had done it" book.
Once Shara's book hits the shelves in Memphis, the city turns against her.
She became a pariah in this town. And again, people thought that she was hiding something, that she was teasing us in a way, that she was manipulative, that she was not the person that she appeared to be.
It's not enough for police to bring charges, but over the next 2 years, their suspicions continue to grow.
In 2015, I interviewed Tony Armstrong, who was the police director. Usually these guys are so guarded. You go talk to a cop, and they're like, they don't want to tell you anything. He willingly did the interview. He all but accused her of this.
Shara suddenly picks up and moves to Houston with a new boyfriend. And then she leaves him for another guy in California.
She wanted to get away, I believe, and try to put this all behind her in some fashion. And that's what she tried to do.
Then, in 2017, investigators finally get a break in the case after receiving a tip.
A lot of us got word that something was brewing and the police department was about to make a big announcement. Later that same day, they announced that they had found the gun in a lake in Walnut, Mississippi. They do ballistics tests, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation does, and they match the shell casings that were found around Lorenzen's body.
The finding of the murder weapon really changed everything.
I remember saying, this is going to crack the case. Primarily because there was no way for the police to just accidentally stumble upon a gun in a lake in remote northeast Mississippi without someone who was actively involved in the homicide itself telling them exactly where the gun was.
To investigators' surprise, the gun isn't linked to Shara Wright or a drug cartel. Instead, it's registered to a 48-year-old church deacon named Billy Ray Turner.
I knew nothing of Billy Turner. I had never heard of Billy Turner before.
My initial reaction was one of being totally baffled. What's going on here?
In some cases, the police have no other option than to offer a plea deal if it's going to lead to catching bigger fish. The criminal can receive a reduced sentence or even immunity if the evidence can be used to prosecute someone else. You would think that most cases end in a trial, but over 90% of the cases in this country end in plea deals. You never want to let someone off the hook who's committed murder, but if it means being able to put everyone involved behind bars, sometimes it's worth it.
In the 7 years since Lorenzen Wright was murdered, Memphis has been struggling to come to terms with his tragic loss.
For a person who was as high profile as he was, and he had played in the National Basketball Association for over a decade, and for him to be killed, the case had generated a lot of publicity.
Because the community wanted to have the answers. It was awfully frustrating for people who wanted to know what happened and wanted to see somebody punished for it.
And in November of 2017, police finally find a piece of evidence that may lead them to his killer.
Finding that gun brought everything about this case back to the forefront.
In the minds of the law enforcement, that was the piece, the critical piece that they needed.
We were ecstatic because we'd waited so long for some news about who did this to Lorenzen.
At first, investigators find it hard to believe that the murder weapon belongs to local church deacon Billy Ray Turner. But it turns out this man of the cloth has a history of violence.
He had been convicted of a few violent crimes, including aggravated assault and kidnapping.
What's particularly interesting, however, is Turner's relationship with Lorenzen's ex-wife, Shara.
Billy Turner had done some work around Shara's house for her. She knew Billy Turner from her church. And at some point, they had a brief romantic relationship.
He also had a lawn service, a yard service, and he actually used to cut her grass. And then we found out that she used some of the money that she got from the insurance to buy him his lawn equipment. So she sort of financed his business.
After all those years of suspecting that Shara had her husband killed, that's the connection that you're looking for. It's not hard to see her getting this guy to do her dirty work.
I never met him, know anything about him. But I knew that Shara was very capable at manipulating men. And I suspected that, like we used to say, he fell for the okie doke.
Before they move in to make the arrest, investigators lay a trap for Lorenzen's killers.
They announced they found this gun in the lake. Now, they haven't arrested anybody, but they found this gun. I'm sitting there thinking, why would you do that? Because they always hold on to everything. But what were they doing is they were floating that out there so that the principal suspects would panic. And that being Shara and Billy Ray. And they tap their phones and they start getting this communication going back and forth. And that's where they find out, that Shara's talking to Billy Ray in code at one point, saying something to the effect that someone went somewhere and found something. We're
any means. They went in the lake and found the gun. They orchestrated that beautifully.
In December of 2017, Billy Ray Turner and Shara Wright are both arrested by Memphis police.
Shara was guilty in the eyes of the community well before she was arrested. So I think when she was arrested, the community felt somewhat vindicated that their suspicions had been correct all along.
I don't know if it gave us complete closure, but certainly the community felt that we were on our way determining once and for all, after all of these years, what actually happened to Lorenzen.
3 months later, at Shara's bond hearing, a clearer picture of Lorenzen's death finally starts to emerge.
Prosecutors drop a bombshell at that hearing, including the tip that the informant was Shara's cousin, Jimmy Martin. He's the one that told them about the gun being in a lake in Mississippi.
Jimmy Martin had been convicted of second-degree murder. While he was awaiting sentencing for that homicide, he met with law enforcement, and he said that he knew the location of that murder weapon.
The kicker is that he says that he knew where the gun was because he was with Shara and Billy Ray after the killing.
He was with Billy Ray when they were cleaning up the murder scene, and they drove down just across the state line into Mississippi and threw this gun into a lake.
And according to Jimmy, it wasn't the first time Shara asked them to kill Lorenzen.
Went down to Atlanta with Billy Ray Turner in the weeks before the murder actually happened, with the idea that they were going to murder Lorenzen down in Atlanta. Billy Ray and Jimmy Martin go to Lorenzen's condominium and open a window and go through the window. Lorenzen isn't there, but there's some guy sleeping on a couch. Lorenzen has a lifelong friend, Michael Gibson, and he's told me that I think I was the guy on the couch. He always found it puzzling that Shara was down there like a day or two before the murder in Memphis. She was down in Atlanta, and it was kind of like, well, what are you doing here? The police information is that she went in the house and unlocked the window.
Jimmy testifies that the first try doesn't work out. So she reschedules for Lorenzen's trip to Memphis. But Jimmy claims he wasn't there.
By his account, he wasn't at the murder. He was more of a cleanup man.
However, Shara's attorneys insist that she had been wrongly accused. If anyone had a reason to kill her ex-husband, it was Jimmy.
When we first got the case and we reviewed the discovery materials, we thought that Jimmy Martin would be the perfect person to have killed Lorenzen. Because, again, he had the opportunity and the ability. He also knew so much about the case. He knew where the murder weapon was, and that's not something that someone who is loosely connected with the case would know. He had killed before, and I thought that he could certainly kill again.
After nearly a decade, Memphis police have finally charged 2 people with the murder of hometown hero Lorenzen Wright, his ex-wife Shara, and her rumored lover, Billy Ray Turner.
Everybody's given her the benefit of the doubt, including me, all this time until they finally unravel the whole thing and she's charged. And then you start thinking about this completely differently.
There were so many people in this town who was just relieved that maybe now we can start to have some closure here, because we're going to finally get to the bottom of what happened here.
However, while Turner had been linked to the murder weapon, the case against Shara is much weaker.
There was a lot of circumstantial evidence that linked Ms. Wright to the case, but not a lot of direct evidence other than the testimony of Jimmy Martin.
As a convicted killer already, he's not the most reliable witness. This is definitely not going to be a slam dunk for the prosecutors.
Despite the lack of evidence, the city of Memphis seems to have already made up its mind.
From the point that she was arrested, she was certainly, in the eyes of the public, she was guilty.
People remember the 911 call. They remember the several days decaying in the hot sun. They remember the lies. So there was no sympathy that was being given to her at that point.
At Shera's pretrial hearing, her lawyers unveiled their defense strategy, and it threatens to tarnish Lorenzen's image as a pillar of the community.
As we reviewed the discovery materials, as we spoke with witnesses, as we spoke with Shera, it became clear that Shera had been abused.
She did have Bell's palsy, which was a result of physical abuse that she had suffered from Lorenzen. So she had nerve damage on one side of her face.
Our defense at the end was that Shera was a battered woman and that Lorenzen Wright had beaten her for several years, that she was filled with rage at being disfigured by Lorenzen, and that she wanted revenge.
As her trial date approaches, the city of Memphis prepares for weeks of scandalous testimony.
It was going to be a brutal trial, and it was going to be scorched earth. If her accounts are true, and she says they are, of the physical abuse, I mean, that's a real problem. Is that reason to kill somebody?
But before opening statements can begin, Shera has another surprise in store.
She suddenly decides to plead guilty. She says that she wasn't the one who killed her ex-husband, but she facilitated the murder.
There were concerns on both sides that a trial would have been very messy. From the state's perspective, I'm sure they were concerned about the abuse that was inevitably going to come out.
They just opted to not do this knockdown, drag out. You know, you never know what a jury's going to do. If somebody's going to plead, that's a slam dunk.
Lorenzen and Shera's 6 children now have to navigate life without their mother and father by their side.
All of the children are doing well, and all the children are very close with each other, which is very good. They remain in contact with each other and talk to each other, I believe, every day.
For the citizens of Memphis, the outcome is controversial.
She gets a 30-year sentence and is going to be eligible for parole fairly shortly, like 7 to 9 years. And that really did shock a lot of people.
We thought it would certainly be life, and then even more so life without parole.
There were a lot of people in this community who felt that they were being cheated out of a trial of her, cheated out of testimony in a court of law. At the same time, there were others who felt, well, at least we know now what we had always suspected, that Shera Wright was involved in killing our beloved Lorenzen Wright, and that she's going to prison as a result of it.
Billy Ray Turner also strikes a deal on weapons charges and receives 16 years in prison. His murder trial is still pending.
People are expecting a thorough prosecution, a thorough case to be presented that not only discloses what involvement Billy Turner had in this death, but also Shera Wright's involvement.
Shera has no plans to testify against Billy Turner. With that said, Shera does not have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent any longer. So if the state of Tennessee subpoenaed Shera to testify against Mr. Turner, she would have to testify.
People are going to want to get the answers that people have been craving in this town for almost 10 years.
truth about Lorenzen Wright's death may never be known, his family and his fans will always remember the man he was, on and off the court.
When I look back on this young man, a phenomenal basketball talent, a caring young man, I can't help but have a sense of loss.
People come up and tell you things like you'll get over it. That's not true. When you lose someone you love, you never really get over it. You learn how to adapt.
We deserve to have full closure of this case. We deserve to move forward past this, knowing that justice was done. And until that happens, I don't think that we will ever be really completely satisfied.